My name is Lainey Rose, and I'm the events manager here at East City Bookshop. It's wonderful to be with you all today. Thanks so much for being here in person and for tuning into our live stream if you're watching that way. Our calendar is always full here, not only with our 14 book clubs, but our many, many events. Next week, we're hosting C.K. Chow for her debut novel, Good Fortune, which is a modern Pride and Prejudice retelling. And the week after that, we'll be hosting R. Eric Thomas and Chasten Buttigieg at the Miracle Theater just down the street. Be sure to check out our website for more information about all of our upcoming events. Before we get to tonight's event, some housekeeping details. Number one, if you could take a moment to silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. Number two, if you need a restroom, it's upstairs past the cash registers and the greeting cards. Number three, if you're watching from home and experiencing any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. My colleague is monitoring and can help if necessary. We will have time for questions tonight for both in-person and virtual attendees, so hold your questions till we get to the Q&A feature. And if you're watching virtually, please put them in the Q&A feature on the Zoom portal so that we can see them and ask on your behalf. And finally, most importantly, if you need a copy of tonight's book, we have copies available and we'll be happy to help you out with that. All those copies are upstairs at the register, not on the shelves, and can be purchased prior to the signing line. I'm so delighted tonight that we get to hear about Wendy Chin-Tanner's King of the Armadillos, a transcendent debut novel about family, love, and belonging, set against the backdrops of 1950s New York City and a historical leprosarium in Louisiana, following one young man's quest to not only survive, but live a full and vibrant life. Inspired by her father's experience as a young patient at Carville, this tender coming-of-age novel is a captivating look at a forgotten radical community and a lyrical exploration of the power of art. Our author of the evening is Wendy Chin-Tanner, who is the author of the poetry collections Turn and Anyone Will Tell You, editor of Embodied, an intersectional feminist comics poetry anthology, and co-publisher at A Wave Blue World, an independent publishing company for graphic novels. Born and raised in New York City, she lives in the Hudson Valley with her family. King of the Armadillos is her first novel. Joining her in conversation is Pam Fessler, who recently retired from NPR, where she has an award-winning correspondent and editor for more than 28 years. Pam also covered poverty and homeland security and oversaw the network's election coverage in the late 1990s. Pam recently wrote her first book, Carville's Cure, Leprosy, Stigma, and the Fight for Justice, which was published in 2020. The American Library Association named Carville's Cure one of its notable books for 2020. And please welcome our authors of the evening.
Hello, everybody. Familiar faces here, I see. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here with Wendy and to talk about a really lovely new book that she has just written about a story that we both care very, very much about. And for the people here who don't know about Carville, I thought maybe first, Wendy, you might be able to kind of set the scene for us, because this story is a story about a young teenage boy who's taken from his home. He's confined in a hospital by the government for a disease. Maybe you can explain what happened.
Certainly, but before I do, don't indulge me. I love taking pictures of my wedding before we begin. So would you mind? Okay. My little ritual. Thank you. What a beautiful crowd.
And we have an online crowd too, as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful crowd there too.
Right. So tell us what was this place and why was this young man confined?
Yes, certainly. So Carville was founded in 1894 on the grounds of a disused sugar plantation on the banks of the Mississippi River. It was a federal, by the time my father was there for 9 years, from 1954 to 1953, it was a federal institution for the treatment of leprosy, and it was also an institution where research happened. The 1950s were in many ways the heyday of Carville. There was an extraordinary patient community. By the time the 1950s rolled around, there were up to 500 patients there. So it was much more like a little town, really, than an institution. It was also hauntingly beautiful. The grounds had con groves and live oaks with Spanish moss and all kinds of amenities that really made it more like, well, to me, when I visited, it looked more like a sort of prep school or a liberal arts college than an institution.
Or a monastery.
Yes,
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
that too, absolutely, absolutely.
So why, maybe just explain for anybody who doesn't know, why did the government confine people there with this disease?
Well, it was entirely unscientific. And in many ways, I think it was political. I mean, leprosy is one of the most misunderstood and stigmatized diseases on earth. Even though it is minimally communicable and entirely curable at this point from 1931 on, there was this quarantine that was inflicted upon people who had the illness. And that was not lifted until, I believe, in 1960s.
Right. And people were forced to go there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So upon diagnosis, people would be forced by the federal government to go to one of the institutions. There was also one in Hawaii on Molokai, but Carville was the only institution of that kind in the continental US. So there were people at Carville from all over the country and even beyond, and all walks of life. It was really a microcosm of American culture in some ways, a cross-section. Not only was it incredibly ethnically diverse, it was also diverse socially. There were people there from the upper echelons of society, and there were also people there who were from marginalized communities and who were illiterate. And there were people there of all ages. So, my father, when he was 16 years old in 1954, he was living in the Bronx with his father. And when he was diagnosed with Hansen's disease, he was sent to Carville, where he stayed until 1963. So that's 9 years, and he didn't leave until he was 25 years old. And so, as you can probably surmise, that was a very formative experience and a formative time for him. So this book, while it is fiction, was inspired by my family. It's a coming of age story, but it's also the story of a complicated Chinese American immigrant family.
And why that? So to me, that was the interesting thing. Like, you had this story, and you knew that your father had these experiences. You could have taken one of two directions. You could have written about his story, nonfiction story, or you could have written what you did write, which is a novel. So why did you decide to write this as a novel?
I resisted writing it as a novel for a very long time, actually. I had never written a novel before. I have a background in poetry, and before that, I studied sociology. My academic background in graduate school was as a sociologist. So knowing that when I conceived of the idea, and when my father gave me license to write about it, I thought that I should probably approach it as nonfiction. That seems like the most obvious genre. And in the social science, we believe that the data has all the answers. So I just started by gathering data. And my father, being part of the Carville family, as they put it, had a backstage pass. So he was able to get me access to an enormous amount of research material. I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages from the museum, that's at Carville now, of medical records, oral histories, issues of The Star, which was a patient-founded and patient-run magazine.
An amazing publication. Yeah. Right.
50,000.
I think it went up to 80,000 at one point. Yeah.
Yes.
Many a local newspaper would be very happy to have that circulation these days.
Precisely, and important mouthpiece for the patients there, and it is important for their self-advocacy. So after a while, I started to hit some impasses with the nonfiction. Firstly, I was overreading material. And secondly, I think I was overwhelmed by the responsibility to authenticity, really. You know, I realized that I was too close to my God in some way to not idealize the character that I was writing him in the book. And also in my research, I discovered that while 15% of the patient population in the 1950s was Chinese and Chinese American, there were really no oral histories given by them. There were no firsthand narratives of this population for whatever reason. It could have been a variety of reasons, but this sort of historical lacuna, this gap in the history, felt like something that I needed to fill. I felt compelled to tell that story as well, and to tell the story of the Carvel community at large, because they were so removed. So this responsibility started to feel very that, and also I wanted to write about a character who discovers music as a gift. And you know, it's based partly in real life. When my father was there, he finished high school, but he was also given, as a form of rehabilitation for his hands, he was given piano lessons, voice lessons, and composition lessons, and he excelled at them. And he wanted to become a professional, although he didn't. But while he was at Carville, he, you know, really developed his skills and gave recitals. He gave a recital at LFU that was covered by the Times Picayune. But in any case, when I was trying to write about this, I realized, well, my father taught me to play the piano as a child. He taught me to sing, but I am not a musician. And you cannot research your way out of that. So I was kind of desperate, and I tried a writing exercise where I translated or transposed my own relationship with writing, my own relationship with poetry specifically, how it feels to write it, how the music of the words come to me. And I transposed that to Victor's relationship with music and his musical awakening. And it worked. All of a sudden, his character became alive, and his character became himself once I put myself into him, as opposed to allowing him to be this idealized image of my father. He became a real person within the fiction of the book, and I realized, you know, this was a novel, and I have to be brave enough to try to write it.
Yeah, and you do such a beautiful job. And I think one of the things that I really liked about the book is, as you mentioned, Carville was a very complicated place. You know, in some ways it was a prison. You know, people were confined there and they were not supposed to leave. They were taken away from their families. But in another way, it was a haven. It was an oasis. And I think you capture that very well with your character, Victor, this young boy, because at some point he has a chance to, he can escape if he wants to, he can run away, but he doesn't. We'll talk about that. Why doesn't he leave? Neither of them? Oh, great. I think mine is on.
Is it on? No? Would you like to help with the tech?
What? Yeah, I think mine's on.
Yeah, I don't. Oh, that okay.
Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, certainly.
Anyway, so talk about why would he stay? I mean, when he really, you know, he was taken away from his family, he wanted to leave, but he didn't because of this other side of Carville. What was?
Yes, I mean, he knew in the book, he knew that if he were to leave, he would not be able to find treatment easily. I mean, he needed extensive treatment. He needed surgery. So once he had his surgery, he knew that he still needed this very extensive drug treatment, and he wasn't sure how he would be able to get it. That, and also the fact that he began to meet a number of other patients who became mentors and friends. And he realized that even within this isolation, because there was a community that was existent there, that he wasn't alone. And if he were to leave, he would have been alone, with his illness, with this illness that stigmatizes people to the extent that it dehumanizes them and reduces them to their illness. And so, he didn't want that.
Right. And
Yes.
he had, and as you talk about in the book, and as I think I've talked about in my book too, they weren't discriminated against within Carville.
Right.
People accepted them for who they were. It was just an incredible world that really didn't exist anywhere else.
Precisely. I mean, I think the fact that it was a shared affliction,
Right.
the fact that, it was such an extreme shared affliction allowed these people who were so different from one another to focus on what they had in common, to focus on the common good. And, that was their impetus, I think, for all of their political action, which was extensive and extraordinary.
Right, which we can talk.
Yes.
Yeah.
But Victor, our character, also meets other teenagers. He goes to, after he starts to get well enough to go back to the dorms, or to the colony, as they called it. He goes to high school and he meets other teenagers whom he befriends, and he also falls in love for the first time. So that's another reason to stay. And he also starts his piano lessons and discovers that he is a musician, and that, this is an avenue for him to, not only learn something new, but to self-actualize. And his journey in the book is one of healing from trauma, I think, in many ways. Victor has had a very tough life. Before he became ill, he had already seen war, famine, immigration, separation from his mother. So, he's learned to roll with life's punches already, even before he was diagnosed with Hansen's. And in order to do that, he numbs himself, as many people do. He compartmentalizes. So one of the things that happens to him through his journey at Carville is that as he heals physically, he also heals emotionally. And through the medium of his music, he's able to reintegrate.
And secrecy plays such a big role in not only Carville, but anybody who's diagnosed with leprosy, because of the stigma. It seems that there's a lot of secrecy, and there is also in your book, because Victor there's one person that he does not tell that he has this disease, and that's his mother, who is still back in China. So I was wondering if you could just read, and I thought this was such a beautiful passage, on page 83. Here, do you want to, here, I can show it.
I've got it.
Yeah, page 83, just starting at the bottom of 83, where it says his insides burn. So he's thinking about the fact that he has not told his mother this very important thing.
Yes, that's right. So his brother, Henry, his older brother, Henry, makes him promise at Bellevue Hospital in New York City before he leaves for Carville to not tell their mother that he has Hansen's or leprosy. His insides burned with shame as he imagined his first lie splitting and multiplying as soon as it hit the page into all the others he'd have to tell. Ma always said that lies were like mice, with one giving birth to 10, and each of those 10 going on to produce 10 more. If their pact had been an anchor, he was now unmoored, drifting further away from her than ever before. His heart stuttered as his breath came shallow and fast. He'd lost Ma once, and now he was losing her again. Henry had said she would die of grief if she knew he had leprosy. Right. But by making him keep the secret, his brother had left him to carry the weight of the truth and the burden of lying all by himself. He laid his head on the desk, his cheek against the cool metal. He'd never felt so alone in his entire life. And with a flash of awareness, he realized that this was what it meant to be a leper.
Yeah, and I just think that captures so well the feeling that so many of these patients had, that they were basically deserted by their family, their friends, and society as a whole. And I'm actually curious, when you were growing up, I mean, did you know that your father had been had leprosy, and had been to Carville, and what was, what did you think?
Yes, absolutely. I knew. I
Which is
suppose.
unusual, actually.
Yes, I guess so. Yeah. Well, I'm an only child and I'm very close to both of my parents. And when I was growing up, there was never a time that I didn't know about Carville. My father was there in his most formative years. So many of his stories, his very best stories, were set at Carville. So for me, when I was a child, I thought of it as a magical and mythical place, almost like Narnia or Oz, And so I never had a sense that it was a secret within our household, although I knew from a very young age that it was a taboo to speak about it outside. As for the secrecy at Carville, many of the patients, when they entered Carville, were both encouraged they were encouraged, but they also felt within themselves that they ought to change their names. They took Carville names so as to protect their families from the extreme stigma of the diagnosis. My father chose not to change his name, which I think that says something about who he is as a person.
And you use Chin in the book too. Right?
That's right.
But his name is not Victor, is your father?
No, it's
yeah,
not,
yeah,
no.
yeah.
His name is Walter.
Walter. But you say in the book that Victor's father, one of the reasons he wants to send him to Carville is he runs a laundromat in New York, and he's afraid that people are going to find out that his son has leprosy and it's going to affect the business. Can you talk? I mean, was that true? Was that based on what happened in your family or not?
No, that was
You made
it.
that.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was embellished. That was fiction.
Although pretty true for a lot of families, I think.
Yes, certainly, and it's based in real misinformation that was disseminated through the media, and that actually originated, I believe, from the head of Louisiana's public health. And this was in the late 19th century, I believe. Pam actually writes about this beautifully in her book. In the late 19th century, there was a panic around Chinese immigration, and there was also a panic around leprosy, and they were, in tandem with one another. And so the head of Louisiana's public health told the public that Chinese laundrymen in New Orleans and in New York City would spit water onto their laundry when they were ironing. And through this method, they would infect their customers and spread leprosy throughout the United States. And so this became a kind of form of propaganda, an impetus to exclude the Chinese from immigrating, and also to, hopefully expel the Chinese who were already in the United States.
Right. And we've talked about this a little bit. I mean, and they used it for, there were unions, white laundromat unions, who were using it to stop Chinese laundry companies from coming into the country. But it was it's totally false. I mean, the whole thing was false. And so maybe can you talk a little bit about that? Just, one of the things I think your book shows, and what we know from the history of Carville, is just how, especially against Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants, disease was used against them.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a long history of the relationship and association between disease stigma and Chinese immigration and anti-Chinese immigration specifically. From the very beginning of Chinese people in the United States, this has existed. The first Chinese women to come to the United States were victims of sex trafficking by and large. And as a result, when they entered the sex trade, they contracted STIs. And so they became associated with disease there and then, and that resulted in the Geary Act. So legislation was also very much tied to this association between disease and whatever population it is associated with. I mean, on a larger scale, sociologically speaking, if we want to do a comparative analysis, this has happened many times throughout history in many other places. For example, the Nazis associated disease with the Jews. And in the Rwandan genocide, this was also a factor.
Right.
Yes. So, you know, there's no coincidence, I believe, that ethnic cleansing is a term for genocide.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, and it just permeates through your book a lot, and because this book is not just about Carville and this family story, it's also an American immigrant
Right.
story. And so I'm curious how, in real life, do you think the fact that your father was a Chinese immigrant affected how he either was dealt with in terms of the disease, or either at Carville, or how his family dealt with the disease? Did that affect it at all?
Well, I think it was a common, as is, you know, so often the case, it was a combination of factors, race and class, right? So my father grew up in obviously a working class family, and they were close to poverty. So one of the factors was financial. My grandfather could not pay for the surgery, and he could not pay for the treatment, and he could not afford to take the time out in order to, you know, schlep my father from the Bronx to Staten Island, where there was an outpatient clinic. So, you know, had he been allowed to stay, he would have had to do that, you know, do like a 3-hour daily commute. And he ran a laundry, and he was the only person to work there. So that was impossible. So it was partly financial in that case. And I don't think that, well, from what my father says, I don't think that it necessarily affected the way that he was treated at Carville. However, he has said a few things that lead me to believe that the Chinese population there was a little bit isolated within the greater isolation. For example, you know, Carville patients won the right to vote in 1946. They were entirely disenfranchised before then. And the Patient Federation was responsible for creating this change. However, my father did say that no one ever registered him to vote. No one ever went to the Chinese house. So, I mean, Carville was integrated, but it was in some ways still segregated.
Right.
There were Negro houses. There was a Chinese house where my father was, you know, sent without question to live. So he did say to me recently that no one ever went to the Chinese house to register anyone to vote.
Interesting.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And you also have an incident in the book, which I found really shocking. I'm curious if it's true. When Victor goes to have surgery, one of the things the doctors deal with, the bacteria can affect the eyes, the nerves around the eyes. So the doctor was going to work on his eyes, and he said, oh, by the way, while I'm doing it, I can give you double eyelid surgery, so your eyes will look more Western. He didn't say that specifically, but he said he could give him this surgery. So did that actually happen?
No, that was fictionalized.
Okay.
However, well, it seemed like a perfect opportunity because the surgery was developed at that time. So the cosmetic surgery for Asian eyelid surgery was developed in Korea during the Korean War in the 1950s. So yeah,
did not
just sort of made sense to put them together.
Right. But that all said, I mean, as you've mentioned, Carville was an incredibly integrated community. I mean, it was, especially even before your father was there, it was in southern Louisiana, and you had, you know, black and white students in the same school together. They had a baseball team together. There were Asians, there were Hispanics. A lot of people from Mexico were there. And it was incredibly diverse. And one of my favorite pictures from Carville, which I'm sure you have seen, is all these men they had a little canteen, and they're, you know, just celebrating Christmas, and there's such a diverse group, and you would never have seen that in any other bar in Louisiana, or maybe even the United States. And so I'm curious what that, what impact do you think that had like on your father? You know, spending these years there, what effect did that have?
Well, I mean, I think that it had an enormous effect on him. I think that Carville had its own culture, and it was a culture that embraced this diversity. I think that it wasn't even just tolerated. I think it was embraced. There was interracial dating that happened among the teens in the 1950s, which would have been far more difficult outside of Carville. My father was also very politically active when he was there. In 1953, a very beloved medical officer in charge, Dr. Johansson, retired, and he was replaced by Dr. Gordon, whom everyone absolutely hated because he instituted these very draconian rules. He placed prohibitions on dating and dancing. He wanted all of the patients to wear hospital clothes. He tried to eject all of the patients from the Virgin Islands even before they finished treatment.
Yeah, these were a group of patients that had been brought in from the Virgin Islands and had been there for many years, and he's just said, send them back.
Yeah. So the Patients Federation, which was by then quite powerful, got together and protested. They used a lot of the tactics from the civil rights movement. They had sit-ins and they had protests. And my father was a young man at the time. He was 16 years old, 16, 17. So it was very exciting for him to, to picket and to make signs and to have sit-ins and to, do all of this stuff. And the Patients Federation, they were able to hire a lawyer. They were able to get a state senator, I believe, on their side, a congressman on their side to go to DC to speak on their behalf. And by 1957, they had kicked him out. They kicked out Dr. Gordon, which is incredible if you think about it.
And so what impact, told me a little bit about what impact do you think that had on your father his whole life?
Yes, absolutely. I think it definitely shaped the way he exercised his citizenship. It heavily affected the way he is an American. He was always very politically involved for as long as I knew him. After leaving Carville, he protested Vietnam and he marched for civil rights, and he's been to many protests with me. We protested Iraq twice, et cetera, et cetera. He was down at Occupy Wall Street too, which incensed my mother, I can tell you that. Yeah, so it really shaped the man he became, and it also shaped the American he became. He was never afraid. He isn't afraid of standing up for what he believes in. He isn't afraid of navigating institutions and pushing against them. He's not afraid of using the legal system. He loves a good lawsuit.
That's great. That's great. Well, and in fact, you talk in the book, there's a wonderful character named Herb Klein, right, who is very thinly disguised version of a man who actually did exist at Carville named Stanley Stein. Maybe you can talk a little bit about him and maybe what impact he had on your father.
Oh, absolutely. Stanley Stein was an incredible person. That was his pseudonym. Actually, his real name was Sidney Levinson. And he took a pseudonym, I think, because he arrived in 1931, 10 years before the advent of the miracle at Carville, which was the sulfone drug that Promin, that started the sort of revolution, I suppose, in Carville of people being able to be cured. But Stanley was, by the time my dad got there in the 1950s, he had been ill for many years before starting treatment. So he was extremely disabled. He had clawed hands, couldn't walk without a cane. He was blind by that point, and he couldn't even read Braille because his fingertips had become insensitive from the disease. So he had to be read to. And my father was one of his readers. And Stanley, however, in spite of all of this, he was a very well-educated man. He had been a pharmacist, and he was also an aspiring journalist and a real theater buff, and he loved music, and he was extraordinarily charismatic. And as a testament to that charisma, he became pen pals initially with the Hollywood star Tallulah Bankhead, and he later became best friends with her, to the extent that, they visited each other, and she badgered all of her Hollywood friends to subscribe to his magazine, The
So I
Star.
don't know if you've mentioned it, but he was the editor and creator of The Star, which was this newspaper that they had.
That's right. Yes, he was the founding editor, and my dad worked with him on The Star as well as reading with him. Yes, he was there for one of the incidents where all of the mail had to be sanitized. All of the outgoing mail had to be sanitized, including all of the issues of The Star. So the sanitization process happened in a laboratory where all of the mail bags would be placed inside a machine and heated to a certain temperature.
And can I just interrupt? Yeah, real quick. Yeah, it didn't. They did it because people were afraid outside that germs might come on the newspaper. It didn't really have to be done, but they just did it.
That's right. Yes, it was entirely unscientific, but it was sort of kowtowing to fear.
Right.
Yes. So my father was there for one incident where a whole batch of The Star was burnt up in the machine because the lab technician who was responsible for turning it off forgot about it. So they had to scramble to put together a new issue to get out to subscribers.
Right. And the newspaper was amazing. I mean, it really had quite an influence on, and Stanley Stein, or Herb Klein, one of his goals was to try and get rid of this stigma that or overcome this stigma or this mythology about leprosy in our culture or internationally even.
Right. Yes, the mission of The Star was to shine a light on Hansen's disease and to combat the stigma that was part of it. And he and the magazine were proponents of using the term Hansen's disease and Hansen's sufferers as opposed to leprosy and lepers. Those terms are pejorative for people who suffer from the illness.
Right. And Hansen was the doctor who discovered the bacteria.
That's right. In 1873, right. Dr. Hansen.
But I think it was really Stanley who was the one who really pushed that whole calling it Hansen's disease.
Absolutely.
Rather than leprosy.
Absolutely. Which is a very modern idea, really.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And he used to send, I don't know if you remember that he used to send notes to advertisers who might use, don't be there was one ad, don't be a locker room leper. I forget what it was for some, floor, foot powder. He wrote a note, irate, said, we are not, a disease people or whatever.
That's right. In social science, there's a term, words make worlds. So Stanley obviously believed in this.
So can you talk about, I know that you did a lot of research for this book once you decided to write it. Can you talk about going to Carville? And I understand that you went there with your father. Maybe you can talk about what that was like. Had he been back before?
Yeah, absolutely. So my dad had not been back. We went in 2016 together for a research trip, and also so that he could give an oral history to the museum. And it had been 53 years since he had been back, because once he was discharged he tells me that at the final meeting with his counselor, with his social worker there, he was counseled to go on with his life and forget about Carville, and to not tell anyone that he had been there, and to not tell anyone about his illness. He had no obvious traces of having had Hansen, so he could get away with it. And so he did that. He went back to New York and rejoined his family and tried to, live his life as if this period of time had never happened. So when he had his change of heart, and we decided to go back for this visit in 2016. It was incredible, absolutely incredible. I think for him it was almost like a heroic homecoming, because not only was he with me, but he was also with my mom and my husband and my 2 little girls. And, you know, so many of the patients at Carville, so many of my dad's peers were not able to self-actualize in the same way. They were, many of them didn't go on to have families, didn't go on to have these full lives. Many of them stayed for the rest of their lives because they didn't have anywhere to go home to. So, you know, I think for my dad, it was just a testament to this life that he had lived. You know, I think one of the things that was so remarkable about the Carville community was that they helped one another not just survive, but to live. They sort of stoked a life force through all of their activities, through their creativity, through their activism. You know, they kept each other alive.
Right, which is something you beautifully capture in this book, I think. We are open to any kind of questions, if anybody has any questions in the audience. And okay, well, yes, and then I'm going to repeat them for the.
And I just wonder if there is a kind of a genre here, a renewed interest in this topic, and you know, and also how your work, you might want to compare it with what you.
So the question was first about the title, which I'm sure many people have the question why it was called. Maybe you could answer that one first.
Yes, certainly. So armadillos are the only other creature besides human beings that can contract Hansen's disease. And so they became very important in Hansen's research. But in the book, it's a symbol and a metaphor because armadillos have this armor, but they're also very vulnerable, just like the patients there.
And he was king of the armadillos because
Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras was a very big deal at Carville.
Right.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
right. They even have a wonderful outside the museum now. They have an armadillo float that the patients had made for their Mardi Gras parade.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question was that there have been other books that are written about, you know, the confinement of people with leprosy. The Island was, which I have not read, but
Nor have I.
okay. So the question was whether, you know, there's a genre reemergence of interest in this topic.
I mean, perhaps I can't really speak to that. I actually quite purposefully avoided reading other literature on the topic, although I did, you know, I read as much nonfiction as possible. I actually, you know, I was telling Pam in the green room that I wrote her a fan letter,
Which I missed.
which she missed because I sent it to her through Facebook Messenger, and she didn't look at her other messages, which is where it would land because we weren't Facebook friends. Yes, so that might be something funny to find later. Yes, but you know, I read all the nonfiction I could find, memoirs, oral histories, but I did not read other fiction. I think I wanted to do my own thing in that sense. I was so afraid of fiction to begin with that I didn't want to be derivative. And also, having said that, there are many books that were touchstones for me. And one of the biggest ones was Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which I read for the first time when I was in college, when I was about 19, in part to try to understand my father's experience better. And of course, for those of you who know the book or don't know the book, it's about a tuberculosis sanitarium in Switzerland. And it's about a young man who goes there and stays for 7 years. So there is a bit of an homage to the Thomas Mann in King of the Armadillos. There are some Easter eggs if you do go on to read it. But the main homage is that, like Thomas Mann's book, mine begins and ends with a train journey.
I mean, I would add that I do think that there is some more interest because of COVID in just our relationship to disease and just how we use it socially, either against people or just how we respond to it.
Yeah, certainly. And there are echoes of it, quarantine and lockdown
Right.
and isolation and stigma.
Right. And prejudice too.
Yes, and prejudice, exactly. And also, once again, this association between disease and particular groups.
Right. Hello.
I have read Pam's book, which I highly recommend.
This is my
And-
friend.
I highly recommend it too.
About the nuns. And I wondered if that, do they figure into the novel?
They sure do.
Actually, let me just repeat the question for the online audience. And the question was about, in my book, I talk a lot about the role of the nuns at Carville, which maybe you can explain what they did there and how they figure in your book as well.
Sure. So the Sisters of the Daughters of Charity, they were a sect of Catholic nuns who, from the start of Carville, were the nursing staff, and they did bring in some federal nurses as well, but the vast majority of the patient care and also the research was done by the nuns. And there are several nuns who are important figures in the book who have an impact on Victor's life.
And they also, it might not be so much in this book, but they also were kind of cheerleaders for them when you talk about them fighting for, social justice, to get their own justice as patients. The nuns were kind of cheerleaders.
Yeah,
right?
they absolutely were. And I think something that was so important about the experience of people entering Carville, something that was so important was that the nuns would not wear gloves. They touched the patients with their bare hands. And that bit of human contact, I think, was very restorative for the patients.
Yeah, and you talk about that when Victor first comes, he's hugged by one of the sisters, right? I believe.
She touches him.
She touches him.
She
Okay,
puts
she
her
didn't hug
her
him.
hand on his shoulder.
Right.
Yeah.
But it does mean a lot to him.
Yes, because he realizes that was the first time since his diagnosis that someone besides his family touched him without gloves.
Right. And it was partly, the nuns, everybody at Carville understood that it really was not that contagious a disease.
Yes, that's right. And 95% of the human population is naturally immune,
Right.
first and foremost. And then the 5% that are actually susceptible, it actually requires sustained contact over months to contract it.
Right.
It's a respiratory
Right.
illness in terms of how it's contracted.
And that's why this is so interesting, because these people did not have to be at Carville.
Not at all.
Yet, as you point out in this book and also in your father's life, he derived actually some benefit from it.
Yes.
It's kind of interesting. Do we have any other questions or? Yes.
Patients actually go through in terms of therapy or restorative activities.
So the question was, what do the patients go through in terms of actual therapy and therapy, restorative and treatment, restorative therapies?
Yes. So Hansen's disease isn't just a skin disease, which I think is the stereotype. It also attacks the nerves. It's systemic. So it can have a variety of symptomatic manifestations. Most commonly, it affects the extremities, the hands and the feet, which over time can become numb. So in addition to lesions, there is the numbness and also pain in the hands and the feet and the arms. My father had issues with his hands and he needed ulnar nerve surgery. So it sort of extended up both of his arms. He has scars that run from about here to here on both of his arms, which I found intriguing as a little girl, actually. I thought they were sort of cool in the way that tattoos are, perhaps. Yes, but so there were a variety of treatments, including paraffin wax treatments and water therapy, and of course the multi-drug treatment therapy, the variety of antibiotics, sulfone drugs. But before the advent of them, there were all kinds of crazy experiments that were done.
Yeah, they used intensive like X-ray heat therapy. They just tried everything, basically. They tried, there was bark from the willow tree that somebody thought was going to cure leprosy. So all the patients went around collecting bark from willow trees, and, they made tea out of it. It was just one thing after another because people were so desperate to find some kind of cure. And it's interesting because the patients, I think, were very active participants in the research because they wanted to get out of there, as much as anybody. And quite frankly, because the disease is not that common even in the United States, the scientific community kind of lost interest for the most part. So if it wasn't for the patients or the doctors at Carville, there would not have been a cure found, because the cure was in fact found at Carville.
That's right. Yes. So patients underwent an enormous amount of guinea pigging,
Right.
Voluntary guinea pigging around many things that were extremely uncomfortable, including, injections of, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Chalmugra oil.
There we
Yes,
go.
that's right.
Chalmugra oil, which was very nauseating, extremely nauseating, apparently. And I believe they tried the smallpox vaccine, diphtheria vaccine,
Right.
all kinds of all kinds of things. And surgery was also a common treatment, particularly for people whose nerves were affected.
But it was interesting. There was actually groundbreaking surgery was developed at Carville, and this was what Wendy's father went through, where they actually removed some or changed some of the nerves in the arm to make that people could manipulate their hands.
Yes, to restore mobility.
To restore mobility when the disease affected their fingers.
Yeah. And there was physical therapy, occupational therapy, and the piano lessons that were given to my father were initially as a form of therapy to rehabilitate his hands after his surgery.
Were there other? Oh yes, hi.
As we're thinking about reading about your book and coming up here tonight, my husband and I were both saying that we grew up in the 40s and 50s, and we grew up hearing leprosy, that it was in our heads. We both were sharing this, and it's surprising, and I think even more than polio at that point. So I guess my question to you is, where did that fear come from? Was there a book? Was there a movie? Why would that have been in our heads growing up in the 40s and 50s?
So I'm going to repeat the question. The question is that, we all, quite frankly, a lot of us grew up fearing leprosy.
Not me, but
not you. Yeah, not you. It's just part of our culture, and many cultures, quite frankly. And why was that? What was the source of this fear?
I think most likely the Bible. I mean, there are references in the Bible to leprosy, which are actually erroneous. In the Bible, there is a conflation of many skin diseases under the auspices of leprosy.
Yeah, and it just permeated the culture. I mean, not just in the 40s and 50s, but certainly, back in medieval times, that there was always this sense that leprosy, that this disease was God's way of punishing, sinners, because of the incorrect depiction in the Bible. And one of the stories that I found very striking when I was doing research for my book was there was a patient named Jose Ramirez from Texas, and he came from a very, very, very Catholic family, and he contracted leprosy, and his mother was distraught because she was a very religious Catholic, and she didn't think that he had done something wrong. She said, God, I did something wrong in my life, and God is punishing me by inflicting this disease on my child. And that had a lot to do with why people were isolated, because, there was just this whole mythology around it, that this was representative of something evil.
Yes, and it would stain and taint an entire family,
Right.
not just the person who suffered from it. And although this was not associated with the Bible, and I don't actually know where it comes from, but in Chinese culture, it's also believed to be a curse for necrophilia or for fornication with prostitutes.
Right. right. Yeah, and I think part of it, tell me if you disagree, but I think part of it was also, advanced cases could really be horrific to look at, to see, just somebody whose skin and, face part, nose might collapse. And so it was frightening for people, and not so much in the 50s, but in the early part of the 1900s, it was kind of terrifying because people didn't know that it was not that contagious, and there was no cure.
And there was extreme disfigurement.
Right.
Yes.
And so I think that that's one of the reasons that it just was part of our culture.
And facial disfigurement, I think that
Right.
factors into it because, since it affects the extremities, our faces are actually cooler than much of the rest of our bodies. So our noses, our ears, it also affects the eyes in many cases, which was why Stanley Stein became blind.
Right,
So
right.
it's scary to look at someone's face, I think, be affected by disfigurement more than perhaps other parts of the body.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've done and looked at this at all, but there are still places around the world today that have places like Carville, where people who do get diagnosed with leprosy are kind of treated the same way. They're sent off, and isolated from their families.
Where does this happen still?
In India, mostly in India, some of the African nations, but mostly I would say India is some of the biggest. There's still leprosy colonies around the world.
So there's still plenty of misinformation to
Totally,
battle.
Totally. Because right now, if you are diagnosed with leprosy, there's medication. They can cure it really quite easily. With this medication, the medication is freely available, but there's about 200,000 new cases a year around the world.
Yes, but in the United States, it's outpatient treatment.
Right.
There's no need whatsoever to stop going to school or stop going to work. Within 2 to 3 days of administering the medication, a person is unable to infect anyone else. And yeah, it's very easily cured.
Right. So I think we're getting close. Oh, we have time for one more question, but I also want to ask you a question too. So any more questions here or online or? So I'm curious, your father now, I mean, he must be so proud of you. What does he think about this book? And I don't know, I'd love to hear about that.
Last night, he said, "When am I going to be on Oprah?"
Well, I think you better start working on that.
Well, he's very excited. He's very excited. And I think he's enjoying the ride of, being the star of the show
Right.
to a degree. He was there with me last night at the New York City event and the night before that in the upstate New York event. So, yeah.
Yeah, you definitely have
loving
to bring him on the road with you.
Oh, yes. Yeah. He's 86 and very spry and extremely chatty and forthcoming. So yes, I think he would be great up here.
What does he think when, about when he looks back at his whole experience? What does he think of it?
Well, I mean, I think he's now really proud of it in some ways. I think he realizes that he was a part of something that was very important. I mean, the way in which he had his change of heart was when he was recovering from cancer in 2012. And he and I were at his surgeon's office, and he was telling his surgeon about his experience with Hansen's and his experience at Carville. And his surgeon knew nothing about it, nothing whatsoever. His mind was blown. And so my dad and I went home and we thought, wow, this is actually something very important that people don't know about. This is a lost piece of American history, not just American medical history, but American cultural history. And that was when he decided that secrets and taboos were for the birds, and that I could write about it if I wanted to.
And we're very glad you did. So
Thank
thank you very
you.
much. And thank everybody for coming. And
Thank
It's
you,
great having
Pam,
something.
for this conversation, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all for being here tonight. Copies are available upstairs. If you'll give us just a moment, we're going to transition this space a little bit to bring a signing table for Wendy to sit and sign at. So if you would like a copy, they're available upstairs. And in just a moment, we'll get their signing table up and ready. Thank you.
Oh, this is my husband.
I miss my grandfather.
Yeah, that's what I was telling you.
And I have to go to their